Big 40k news here today. The balanced data slate has been revealed in full. There's nerfs to Tyranids and Harlequins, and buffs to Space Marines and Admech. Let's talk through the winners and losers, and see how much they were buffed or hit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a short summary of the much anticipated balanced data slate. We've known that this has been coming for really quite a while now, and a chance for Games Workshop to fine-tune their armies, giving some buffs and some nerfs, and trying to make everything a little bit fairer. As they said in previous MetaWatch articles, they're largely a little bit more happy with game balance than they have been in the past, so there was always the chance that this one might be a little bit more light touch than some. It does seem like the buffs and nerfs really have fallen on some niche units or army rules. Still though, certainly looks like it might shake up some of the top performers in 40k, and give a small boost to some of the units at the bottom. So broadly speaking, the balanced data slate has remained fairly similar to the previous incarnation. There's no really big surprises in it, or additional sections that we weren't expecting. It is just additional special rules or nerfs to certain armies. There aren't any points changes in the document. It seems that they're keeping them coming with the chapter approved, so I guess the next one might be due sometime in January. And to be honest, I feel like that might be a bit more of a powerful tool for them actually drastically rebalancing armies, as opposed to tweaking in-game rules. As well as this, there's nothing more for the Imperial Guard yet. We know that there's a new codex for them coming round the corner, so I do kind of agree with them that any further changes to them would have been a little bit on the pointless side. Otherwise, most of the big sweeping changes remain, everything like Armour of Contempt, those flyer limits, the barrage and bodyguard nerfs, and things like that. No major changes to those that I could see. It does seem that the alterations are mainly just falling on individual armies. Basically, within this document, there are 3 different armies that have got additional nerfs: Tyranids, Harlequins, and Necrons, and 2 armies that have got small buffs, Space Marines and Admech, though I must admit these buffs do feel pretty underwhelming to me. Just roughly going through them, the Tyranids got their Leviathan trait nerfed a little bit, the Reaper of Obliterax got a bit worse but it's still usable. For the Harlequins, they've piled a second nerf on top of the Sadath of Light, making it a bit worse with transports. For Space Marines, they've buffed a secondary objective that very few people were taking to start with. For Admech, they've removed their previous nerfs from the balanced data slate, effectively giving a bit of a boost to the enriched round stratagem. And for Necrons, they've removed core from any character vehicles, basically the Silent King and the Catacomb Command Barge. Going through them in a little bit more detail, first up for the Tyranids, Leviathan basically got worse. Currently they are by far the most commonly played Hive fleet at tournaments and things. The primary part of their trait basically gives them a transhuman physiology type rule, unable to be wounded on 1s or 2s army-wide, and synapse creatures are unable to be wounded on 1s, 2s or 3s, a really nice durability boost for things like warriors and zoanthropes. The way that they've changed that is that the synapse rule now only applies to synapse monsters, so things like the infantry characters, the zoanthropes and the warriors, they're all able to be wounded on 3s now with heavy weapons and things. It definitely makes those a fair bit worse in Leviathan itself. I guess for warriors you might see a few more people running Raveners now. They're also a very powerful datasheet and won't be affected by this change. But just in general, I feel like it is a fairly reasonable nerf to Leviathan as a whole, and it might get a bit more balance between them and the other Tyranids factions. Warriors still seem fine, even in Leviathan. They will still get that mini transhuman effect when it applies, but I feel like overall it is quite a good change. It's still a decently powerful Hive fleet, though it'll be interesting to see if Tyranids players pivot to something like Kraken a bit more. The other change for the Tyranids was a small nerf to the Reaper of Obliterax. This is the near auto-include Bonesword relic that applies to flying Hive Tyrants. Before the data slate, it's basically a very powerful combat weapon with a damage of 3, and the relic version of it allows you to ignore Feel No Pain or damage caps for things like Catan or Abaddon, and on top of that you also get an additional mortal wound every single time you make a wound with it. This meant that the common play was often to take a winged Hive Tyrant, give it the adrenal glands and use the adrenal gland stratagem. That would get you an average of 7 attacks, and with inbuilt rerolls that could easily be a stack load of normal damage, plus maybe something like 5 or 6 mortal wounds depending on the target. Then after that maybe you use Overrun and get to zoom it back into safety. The way that they've toned down the relic is to limit the mortal wound output of it. Now instead of getting a mortal wound every single time you wound, the mortal wound damage from it is capped at 3 mortal wounds, so you're going to be relying on its primary damage a bit more than the mortal wounds. It definitely makes it a little bit less of an anti-everything weapon, though to be honest I think as a relic it's still pretty effective. You are probably going to be hitting that mortal wound cap most of the times that you fight with it, so you've still basically got a relic that gives you an extra 3 mortal wounds, plus cutting through the Feel No Pain and damage caps, and I feel that overall that's in a pretty good place. Seems like a pretty reasonable change to me, a bit toned down on one of the strongest units in one of the strongest codexes in 40k, while still keeping the option very usable in my book. Overall, seeing as Tyranids were doing very well, these both seem like very sensible changes to me. Targeted nerfs that affect some of the most auto-include stuff without affecting the majority of the codex should definitely rein in Tyranids a little bit, but I'm not certain that this will stop them from being one of the top factions in 40k. Space Marines next, and I must admit I did find this a bit of a disappointing part of the data slate. In the past they have been brave enough to make some really quite groundbreaking changes, things like Armour of Contempt, which gave all the Marine factions a bit of a lift, and with core codex Space Marines struggling quite so much at the moment, I was wondering if they might do something a little bit braver again, maybe some sort of generic buff to bolt weapons across the board. Instead though, what we've got is a small change to one of their secondary objectives, Shock Tactics. This is basically an option that's really quite rarely played by competitive Space Marine lists in general, and I'm really unconvinced as to how much of a lift it's going to give the army overall. Even if you boost it, you might just get to the point where it's usable rather than pretty bad, and if you really did want to raise the victory points that Marines scored, it might have been better to buff one of the ones that was taken more commonly. The rules for this one is that you have to score 3 victory points for basically taking an objective off your opponent and you hold it at the end of your turn. Not the hardest thing to do, though you can't score it on the first battle round normally, and the way that they've altered it is now that instead of getting 3 victory points, you get 4 instead. I do feel like it makes it far more usable. Doing it 3 times for 12 victory points over the course of a game does seem a lot more manageable, and I feel like it would compete better with the other secondaries now. Realistically though, even if you went from a standpoint of taking this every single game, which Marine players weren't, I think it's only likely to add up to something like 2 or 3 more victory points over the course of one, which I think is rarely going to be the case to swing a loss into a win unless it was ridiculously close already. A little bit more balance on the Marine secondaries is definitely no bad thing, but honestly this is a pretty disappointing buff for Space Marine players in general. I feel like they could have got a lot more wide-reaching, maybe buffing Marine shooting a little bit, seeing as combat Marines seem to be the way to go for the most part. Like I said, I think they could have given some sort of meaningful damage boost to bolters literally across the board for Space Marines, and it wouldn't have been too much, so this does kind of feel like an opportunity wasted. I guess if they are looking to turn Marine players' fortunes around, they might be aiming to do that with points buffs and things, but that would have to wait till the next chapter approved likely in January. Overall, pretty unexciting news for Space Marine players, in my opinion. Next up for the armies that were buffed a little bit are the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the change that they decided to make for them is to basically just remove all changes from the balanced data slate, as they previously had a lot of nerfs left over from when they were dominating the game with very undercosted units. Previously they got core Iron Striders back, which actually gave them some decent firepower, and now the major change of this one is that the enriched round stratagem has become very tempting again. It's 1 CP to make your Vanguard Radium Carbines a lot more vicious. Rather than wounding on 6s automatically, they wound on 4s automatically. Previously it had been nerfed so it only wounded on 5s. If you have a big massed up blob of Skitarii Vanguard, then this can be absolutely brutal. Even without any other rerolls or buffs or anything, that would mean that you're basically stacking 30 auto wounds on any non-vehicle within range, which is pretty mad. When they first dropped, they were one of the few things that could really efficiently down Mortarion without too much issue, though I guess since then they have actually gone up a point at least, so they're not quite on that same level as they were at release still. Access to this one really does make them a lot more tempting of a choice once more. I feel like a lot of people are running Rangers at the moment with their longer range. I'd say that this now swings hard enough to make them probably the better of the two, particularly if you have some rerolls going on, say reroll 1s to hit from a Dominus. I must admit though, while giving Admech another brutal shooting option is no bad thing at all, I do think it's perhaps not the most enormously helpful for internal balance. As it goes, the Skitarii troops were already one of the better things in the Codex compared with a bunch of the vehicles or Court Mechanicus stuff, so buffing them even further does seem like it's not going to help internal balance anymore. Overall, again, I think that a reversal of a nerf to 1 stratagem is not going to be anywhere near enough to catapult Admech into being a bit more of a balanced faction against other armies. I think they really needed a bit more than this. Again, some sort of broad-based sweeping buff to Court Mechanicus units or something like that could have been sensible. I do feel like a fair few of their units are just a little bit overpointed at the moment though, from their big nerf that they got after doing well for a while. I think you could afford to knock a good 5 or 10% off quite a lot of their codex to try and get some of their lesser played options on the table a bit more, alongside things like the Skitarii troops and the Ruststalkers and Iron Striders. Next up on the nerf list we have Necrons. They have been nosing around the top of the tournament scene for really quite a while now. Though in their design discussion around this balanced data slate, they did say that the main reason for these getting tones down wasn't really their in-game power, it was more just because the rules were interacting in a way that they weren't intending. In a previous balanced dataslate, they gave core to all the Necron vehicles. Perhaps they weren't really intending that the Silent King would get core himself, as that gave rise to a whole load of slightly weird interactions, the Silent King profiting massively from his own rerolls, plus slightly janky shenanigans like the Cryptex being able to resurrect his Menhirs. The main change is that they've removed core from character vehicles for Necrons, namely this applies to the Silent King and the Catacomb Command Barge. I feel like the Command Barge will feel it will break a few synergies with that, and it is a fairly decent gun and melee platform, but really the Silent King is the big news here. He's almost auto-include level at just about every single Necron list competitively, and this will definitely make him a bit more tame. Perhaps losing his own innate rerolls is the biggest thing. He'll no longer reroll his own wound rolls in combat or hit rolls at range. You can't play games with resurrecting his Menhirs, and there's plenty of other things within the codex that gave him some pretty powerful boosts that just now won't apply. I feel that this one is a pretty reasonable change though, to be honest. It's still going to be very usable in Nephilim, giving you those 3 extra command points, plus his decent enough melee and shooting stats, and also giving rerolls to all the core Necron units. I think he's still going to remain very usable. He's just a little bit less auto-include than he was before, which I don't think is a bad thing, seeing as just about every Necron list was running him. I don't think there's any danger of Necrons suddenly becoming massively underpowered with this. They were kicking around the top of the tournament scene, and they have been for quite a while. They still have massively powerful secondary objectives that are very hard for other factions to stop, and they still have that very powerful dynasty combo with objectives secured in the pre-game move, which makes them very hard to beat on the primary mission game. I feel like in a balanced dataslate it might not have been the worst time to maybe try and address the dynasties and make some of the standard ones a bit more palatable. It does seem a bit weird that that custom one is quite so prevalent at tournaments, maybe though that might need to go hand in hand with buffing some other weaker units within the codex. Could be something that they might decide to look at along with the next chapter approved and things. Harlequins next, and another one of the factions that's easily in the top of 40k in terms of tournament wins. Them and Tyranids have been pretty much ruling the roost in the meta still, with win rates in the high 50s. The way that they've decided to try and rein in Harlequins a bit is to try and nerf the light Sadath again. It's kind of funny that this one's already been toned down a bit in a previous dataslate. It used to make you impossible to hit on 1s to 3s at greater than 12 inches, then it became 18 inches, and the other part of the Sadath allows you to advance and shoot weapons normally, giving you some really big boosts to scooting around the board and shooting things with fusion pistols. Now though, they have struck a rather big blow against one of the most common Harlequin army archetypes. The Sadath of Light now no longer allows you to advance and shoot pistols from within a transport, and this really is quite a big blow against the common light list that have a whole load of fusion pistols and Eurodisruptors in them, and can just zoom around in a glittering shoal of jet bikes, blasting you out of your transport capacity with scary pistols at close range. It's not that you won't be able to still do that tactic, but basically within the Sadath of Light, that now means that you'd be losing 6 inch of movement, seeing as the Star Weavers advance 6 automatically. And if you want to shoot pistols out of transport, then basically Dark or Twilight are going to be equally good at that now. I feel that this is a fairly meaningful nerf, and will probably shift people away from the Sadath of Light a fair bit. It'll be interesting to see how much it still competes with things like Void Weavers and the guns on the Star Weavers themselves, but perhaps might push people a bit more towards melee Harlequins and things like Dark and Twilight. It doesn't seem like the worst thing in the world though for an army with a win rate in the high 50s. Again, like the Tyranids, I feel like this change is unlikely to make them into a truly bad army, just maybe a bit more towards mid-tier. So overall, I feel like it's a bit of a mixed bag for this data slate. Some things I think are really quite sensible. Basically, I feel that the nerfs that they've done are really quite well targeted, and perhaps hit some of the most auto-include options in some of the strongest factions in the game. They all seem like pretty reasonable changes, but don't look like they'd go so far as to make the armies that they're targeting bad. However, on the other side of the spectrum, I do feel like the buffs are really quite underwhelming indeed. Codex Space Marines is not going to get turned around by one secondary getting a bit better. They could have gone a lot more wide-reaching, or particularly done targeted buffs for some of the struggling chapters, say for example Imperial Fist or Raven Guard perhaps. It's similar for AdMech. Having Vanguard on murder mode is really quite nice for them. It will definitely help them stack a whole ton of nasty saves against any non-vehicle targets about, but again it's not exactly going to be something that overturns the fortunes of a whole faction. Really it's the Cult Mechanicus stuff and the non-Iron Strider vehicles that need a bit of a lift, and it would have been a lot nicer to see something to help them. Overall though, not the hugest shake-up, probably good news for any armies in the mid-tier where the top-tier ones are maybe just looking a tiny bit less threatening, and I will admit that all of these are pretty much steps in the right direction, just maybe not going quite far enough in some cases. Let me know what you think though down in the comments below. which of these changes are your favourites and which ones are the worst, and are there any important implications that I might have missed in the video. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's updates and news, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly cover any game updates that they have and any new models that they release. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you're interested. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making regular updates like this and cover 40k news as my main thing. If you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.